If someone were to say that a war could begin with a spreadsheet, many people would laugh. But that's how Germany in the 1930s began to breathe again. Not with grand speeches from the podium, but with cold numbers, stamps, signed papers, and decisions made in silent rooms. The real shock is this. Behind the regime that promised rebirth, there were people who seemed ordinary, with tired faces, dark suits, and the demeanor of civil servants. And at the center of this engine in the beginning was a discreet-looking banker named Hjalmar Schacht. He wasn't the man of shouts, nor the man in the uniform. He was the man of the keys to credit, to currency, and to how to pay when a country has no way to pay. The Germany that Hitler inherited upon assuming the chancellorship on January 30th, 1933, was a wounded and fearful nation. The Great Depression had bankrupted businesses, shattered family savings, and pushed millions into unemployment. The feeling was one of the ground disappearing beneath their feet. When a father returns home unemployed for months, it's not just income that vanishes. Respect, rhythm, and peace disappear as well. When a mother counts coins to choose between bread and coal, the future becomes a narrow corridor. And when an entire generation grows up witnessing queues, humiliation, and empty promises, it begins to accept almost any voice that says, "I'll take care of it." In this scenario, Hitler offered easy, quick, and dangerous answers. He promised work, pride, and order. Many heard this as salvation. Others heard it as a threat. But even for those who didn't believe him, there was a concrete fact. Germany needed jobs. It needed economic activity. It needed some kind of practical miracle. And that's where Schacht comes in as a key player. He was already a respected name in the financial world, with experience and influence. He wasn't an unknown figure pushed by chance. For many, he was an expert capable of doing the impossible, restarting the machine without letting the currency explode into runaway inflation. And the first uncomfortable question arises right here. When a country is desperate, how far will it go to get back to functioning? Will it accept losing freedom in exchange for stability? Will it accept surrendering rights in exchange for bread? Will it accept letting someone decide for everyone, if that means normality tomorrow? Schacht helped create a system in which the state would become the economy's main customer. Instead of waiting for the private sector to reinvest on its own, something difficult in a crisis, the government would begin to commission, hire, move, and pay. In practice, this meant construction projects, contracts, production. It meant factories with orders. It meant workers with salaries. And when salaries start flowing back into people's pockets, commerce breathes. When commerce breathes, small businesses reopen. When they reopen, hope returns. The psychological effect of this is enormous. A nation that feels humiliated begins to feel on its feet again. But financing this movement wasn't simple. The state had limits, debts, and restrictions, and the system needed to avoid inflationary panic. That fear that destroys people's confidence in money. The central idea was to get money into the real world with an appearance of control, as if issuance and spending were part of an organized cycle, tied to concrete deliveries. The state promised to pay for orders, and this promise circulated through banks and companies until it became payment. The technical detail matters less than the human effect. The economy began to move again, and many people concluded that the new government worked. But along with the jobs came a silent exchange. Workers who previously had independent unions capable of pressing for better conditions saw that space disappear. Strikes were banned. Organizations were dissolved or absorbed by state-controlled structures. What was once negotiation became obedience. And the question becomes even sharper. If a country reduces unemployment but silences the worker's voice, is that recovery or control? The regime sold the idea of unity. One people, one goal. In crises, this phrase can sound like shelter, but it can also mean one order without debate. The worker who previously had the means to complain now needed to be grateful. And many were indeed grateful, not because they were bad, but because they remembered the worst. The memory of hunger and unemployment weighs heavily. Immediate need overcomes concern for the long term. When someone has children at home, the promise of stability has an almost physical power. And thus the regime achieved something that no money can buy, the feeling that it had given life back. The agricultural sector was also drawn into this logic. Farmers suffered during the crisis. Prices fell, debts grew, and the idea of losing their land was a nightmare. The government offered protection, price controls, and stability. For many, this seemed like a helping hand. But again, the bill came due. More control, less freedom. Agriculture became rigidly organized. Selling, buying, choosing paths, everything became more dependent on the state. And anyone who thinks this was just organization needs to face the real question. When the state controls food, it controls the entire country. None of this on its own explains the strength that Germany would gain in a short time, but it shows how the regime built an emotional foundation. Fear transformed into relief, chaos transformed into routine, despair transformed into discipline. And here a curious fact emerges that is unsettling. Authoritarian regimes rarely begin by offering explicit terror to everyone. They begin by offering solutions to some. They begin by offering order. They begin by offering an easier tomorrow. And when people realize the full price, many are already inside the system. Shocked in that beginning wasn't the face of hatred. It was the face of competence. And that's dangerous because it's seductive. Competence makes people relax. Competence creates confidence. Competence makes someone say, it may not be perfect, but it's working. But working can serve different purposes. The economy can work to feed families, and it can work to fuel a power project. And what the regime wanted, behind the public discourse, was beginning to become clear in its priorities. The state wasn't just investing in civilian things, it was investing in structures that also served greater mobilization. Employment was growing, yes. But to produce what? To build what? To prepare for what future? When a country begins to treat industry as an arm of a total political plan, the line between recovery and preparation for conflict becomes thin, almost invisible to the naked eye. Many people didn't see or didn't want to see. Others saw and preferred silence. Germany was still a country connected to the world. There was trade, there was diplomacy, there were journalists, there were warnings. But warnings, when they don't interest anyone, can become noise. And that's another uncomfortable question. How many times does a danger grow because the people who could stop it think that it's not that serious, or that it's not their problem, or that we'll deal with it later? Meanwhile, inside Germany, the regime tightened social control with methods that seemed bureaucratic, not violent. A piece of paper here, a rule there, a registration over there. A worker who wants to change jobs encounters obstacles. A citizen realizes that complaining has a cost. A businessman understands that resisting causes problems. The system creates incentives for obedience and punishments for dissent. This doesn't seem like an explosion. It seems like a machine. And then comes the micro-conflict that drives the story forward. If the economy improves, who will have the courage to say no? Who will want to be the party pooper? Who will want to be the pessimist who warns about the danger when the refrigerator is full of food again? Schacht, in his own statements after the war, would try to portray himself as someone who sought to stabilize the country and who did not control the political direction of the regime. And it is true that economic power within Nazism would change hands and focus over time. But, in the beginning, he helped pave the way, and even if he wasn't the author of every brutal decision of the regime, he was one of those who helped build the ground on which all of this would be built with greater force. History doesn't need monsters in every position to become monstrous. It needs a sufficient number of ordinary people doing the necessary work, without asking why, without asking how far, without asking who pays the human cost. And that's the humanitarian critique that runs through everything. When rights are dismantled to achieve efficiency, the cost doesn't appear in the accounting, but it appears in life. At the end of this first stage, the country seemed to have emerged from the abyss. Unemployment was falling, contracts were increasing, and the public sentiment was one of recovery. Propaganda helped transform numbers into emotion, and emotion into loyalty. But the engine that Schacht helped to start was not neutral. It was being coupled to a project that demanded ever more resources, ever more discipline, and ever fewer limits. And then comes the question that changes the tone of everything. If this growth depended on control, on hidden debt, on state orders and a silenced society, what would happen when the regime needed something that Germany didn't have in sufficient quantity? Raw materials, fuel, access, territory? How to maintain a fast-paced economy when the country itself doesn't have everything it needs to sustain that speed? The answer isn't in the discourse, it's in the next step. And the next step wouldn't just be economic, it would be geographical, it would be political, it would be an advance that would transform recovery into expansion. Because when a machine is built not to stop, it starts looking for fuel outside its own walls. And that's exactly where the story gets more dangerous and inevitable. If this story made you stop for a moment and think, then it has already fulfilled its first purpose. Because what has been told here is not just about Germany in the 1930s, it's about how silent decisions, made in closed rooms, can change the fate of millions without almost anyone realizing it at first. If you want to understand, how did that gear keep turning? Why did she need to expand beyond borders, and what was the human and economic cost of that choice? Follow the channel now. Like this content so that more people can have access to this reflection, and leave a comment. Tell us what has caught your attention the most so far. Was it the fear, the promise of stability, or the silent trade-off between freedom and security? The next part reveals the step that transformed recovery into expansion, and then into war. Don't miss it. When the German economy began to move again, many people believed that the worst was over. Factories reopened, salaries started arriving in accounts again, shop windows were no longer empty. For the average citizen, this translated into simple things. The father returning home from work with less silence on his shoulders, the mother no longer having to choose between food and heating, the young person who, for the first time in years, saw some kind of future. Daily life seemed to regain a rhythm that had been lost. And it is precisely at this point that the danger becomes almost invisible. Because while the average citizen saw only a return to routine, the regime saw something much bigger, a machine that had started working again and needed to keep running. The problem is that this machine hadn't been built to slow down. It demanded constant orders, growing contracts, and continuous production. An economy driven primarily by state orders doesn't survive on stability. It survives on expansion. And expansion, sooner or later, demands more than the country itself can offer. Here's a simple question that anyone can understand using an everyday example. Imagine a family that gets out of deep debt because someone lends them money and guarantees them temporary work. In the first few months, everything improves. Bills are paid, groceries are bought, relief arrives. But this work always requires more spending, more commitment, more money up front. If real income doesn't grow at the same rate, there comes a point when this family needs to seek resources outside, sell something, take out more loans, or take what isn't theirs. The German economy was entering exactly this logic. The regime needed steel, oil, rubber, copper, and food on a large scale. It needed inputs that Germany did not possess in sufficient quantities. Initially, it tried to resolve this with trade agreements, exchange controls, and complex exchanges. Foreign companies continued to operate in the country, often because they still saw profit there. From the German workers' point of view, this did not seem wrong. A manufactured truck, an assembled engine, an active factory meant employment. Few wondered where these products were going or what their final use would be. Meanwhile, the state tightened social control even further. Workers could no longer freely change jobs. Farmers could no longer decide the fate of their own produce. Business owners understood that resisting the regime's directives was not a safe option. Consider something simple. Today, if someone feels wronged at work, they look for another job, file a complaint, or protest. In Germany during that period, these avenues were closed off one by one. Job security came with mandatory silence. Even so, for many, it still seemed worthwhile. After all, there was work. And work, after years of misery, becomes an almost absolute argument. It's difficult to convince someone who has once again put food on the table that there is a distant danger brewing. The human brain prioritizes the present. Tomorrow can wait. This psychological mechanism is not unique to that time. It exists today, wherever economic fear takes hold. The economy continued to grow, but increasingly geared towards military production. Roads, factories, shipyards, and industrial projects had a dual function. They appeared civilian, but were ready to serve a much larger endeavor. The regime did not completely hide its intentions, but neither did it announce them directly. It was a gradual, almost pedagogical preparation. The population became accustomed to the idea that strengthening the country required sacrifices. And sacrifices, when presented as necessary for collective survival, rarely encounter immediate resistance. Meanwhile, another crucial mechanism emerged: the exploitation of external opportunities. The world was still trying to recover from the crisis, and many countries were more concerned with their own problems than with what was happening within Germany. Foreign companies continued to supply technology, inputs, and know-how. For them, this was often just business. For the regime, it was oxygen. The question that almost no one asked was simple and uncomfortable. To what extent does profit justify ignoring what is being built with it? Gradually, the internal discourse changed its tone. The talk was no longer just about recovery, but about destiny, greatness, the necessary space for the German people. Abstract words, but with very concrete consequences. When a government starts saying it needs more space, more resources, more control, it rarely means peaceful negotiation. It means the economy has already exceeded the limit of what it can sustain on its own. In everyday life, this was reflected in subtle ways. Civilian consumption did not grow at the same rate as industrial production. Some products began to become scarce. The state justified this by saying it was temporary, that it was necessary to prioritize the collective good. And again, many people accepted it. After all, who complains when the country is rising up? Who wants to be seen as selfish at a moment described as historic? This is where the story begins to accelerate. The German economic machine needed something that couldn't be created with decrees or promises, strategic raw materials on a large scale. And when an entire system depends on it, the pressure ceases to be theoretical. It transforms into a political decision. The logic becomes, if we can't buy in sufficient quantities, we need to guarantee access. And guaranteeing access in an unstable world almost always means moving forward. This advance didn't begin with tanks crossing borders. It began with diplomatic pressure, veiled threats, and economic demands. Smaller countries felt this first. For them, resisting meant risk. For the great powers, it meant a problem that could be postponed. And postponement is exactly what happened. Each concession made to the regime reinforced the idea that it could go further without facing real consequences. For the average citizen, both inside and outside Germany, all of this still seemed distant. Life went on. People went to work, raised children, made small plans. History, however, had already taken another turn. The economy was no longer just a tool for recovery. It had become a weapon that needed to be constantly fed to avoid collapsing. And then comes the psychological tipping point. When a system becomes dependent on expansion to survive, stopping ceases to be an option. Not because anyone is inherently cruel, but because the entire structure is at risk. Contracts would fall apart, factories would close, unemployment would return. And the regime knew that if this happened, the same population that supported it could turn against it. The fear of losing control became as strong as the desire to grow. Thus, the economy pushed politics forward, not the other way around. The need to keep the machine running led to decisions that, viewed in isolation, seemed strategic, rational, even defensive. But together they formed a path of no return. Germany was no longer just recovering. It was preparing to move forward. And each step taken made the next one harder to avoid. The real suspense lies not in if this would lead to conflict, but in when and how. Because when a country builds its stability on control, silence, and forced expansion, it doesn't need a moral reason to move forward. It only needs continuity. And continuity, at that point, already meant crossing borders. From that point on, the economy would cease to be a silent backdrop and would begin to dictate the pace of events. What seemed like a solution to the crisis would begin to reveal its true cost. And in the next stage, this mechanism would cease to operate solely within Germany. It would begin to feed off the world around it, forever changing the destiny of millions of people. There comes a point when every mechanism reveals its true price. In the case of Nazi Germany, this moment didn't come suddenly, nor with a single visible collapse. It came in layers, like a deep weariness spreading through the body before the fall. The economy that had been presented as the solution began to demand more than it could receive. More resources, more control, more lives. What began as recovery ended as absolute dependence on expansion. And when expansion became impossible to sustain, everything crumbled. The regime had built a system that only functioned through continuous movement. Industry needed constant orders. The state needed to maintain jobs to avoid internal revolt. Propaganda needed to fuel a sense of strength. But none of these elements worked without something fundamental: real resources: fuel, minerals, food, labor. Germany did not possess all of this in sufficient quantity. The answer found was simple and devastating: take it from outside. In this context, war was not merely an ideological or military decision, it was an economic consequence. Each occupied territory was seen not only as a geographical space, but as a repository of resources, factories, workers, and financial reserves. In the short term, this kept the machine running. In the long term, it destroyed the very foundation that sustained it. Local economies were drained to their limits. Infrastructure was used without replacement. People were reduced to numbers, a disposable workforce. Forced labor became a central part of the system. Millions of people were torn from their homes to keep factories running, not out of gratuitous cruelty, but because the regime had no other choice within the logic it had created. When an economy depends on coercion to exist, it is already fundamentally bankrupt. Productivity fell, efficiency plummeted, and the human cost grew irreversibly. No spreadsheet can hide that for long. At the same time, isolation intensified. Partners drifted apart. Routes were disrupted. Fuel ran out. Tanks stopped not for lack of steel, but for lack of fuel. Planes were grounded. The industry, once presented as a symbol of strength, began to show clear signs of exhaustion. Bombings accelerated the collapse, but were not the main cause. The cause lay in the model. An economy that needed to dominate in order to survive ends up destroying everything around it, including itself. In the end, there was no economic miracle, no stability, no grandeur. What remained were ruins, hunger, and silence. The machine that promised a future left only wreckage. And it is here that history ceases to be merely the past and becomes an uncomfortable mirror of the present. Because the mechanisms that led to this collapse do not belong to a distant time. They reappear whenever societies accept exchanging freedom for the promise of efficiency, criticism for obedience, conscience for immediate comfort. And that's precisely why this story matters today. Not to point fingers or repeat easy judgments, but to extract practical and applicable lessons. The first is simple. Any solution that demands silence as a price should be questioned. When someone says, "It's not time to discuss," that "we'll see later," that "now we just need to function," the alarm bells should ring. Functioning without reflection is the shortest path to collective error. The second lesson is personal. No system sustains itself. It needs people who obey, who normalize, who adapt. This doesn't mean everyone is guilty, but it means everyone has a responsibility for where they put their energy, their work, and their voice. In everyday life, this translates into small choices. Questioning unfair decisions, not normalizing abuses, not accepting that efficiency justifies dehumanization. The third lesson is economic, but profoundly human. Hidden debt, artificial growth, and forced expansion always take their toll later. This applies to countries, companies, and individuals. If you live at a pace that can only be maintained under constant pressure, with no margin for error, no room for pause, collapse is not a distant possibility. It's only a matter of time. Sustainability is not slowness, it's balance. And here comes a simple, practical, and achievable strategic plan for those who wish to transform this learning into concrete action. First, develop the habit of critical reading. Don't accept ready-made narratives. Ask, who does this work for? And who pays the cost? Second, value spaces for dialogue. Where there is no debate, there is risk. Third, take care of your economic autonomy. Unplanned debt, absolute dependence, and lack of savings make anyone vulnerable to easy rhetoric. Fourth, practice active empathy. When groups are dehumanized, the problem never stops with them. It spreads. These actions don't require political power, public office, or influence. They begin with the individual and spread as culture. History shows that great tragedies are born not only from extremist leaders, but from weary societies, fearful and willing to accept shortcuts. Resisting this is not heroism. It is responsibility. Hjalmar Schacht ended his life in freedom, legally acquitted, but forever carrying the weight of having helped build a machine that spiraled out of control. His case reminds us that competence without ethics is not a virtue. It is a risk. That intelligence in service of an inhumane project cannot be neutralized by belated good intentions, and that the judgment of history is broader than any court. If this story touched you in any way, if it sparked discomfort, reflection, or identification with current situations, that's no coincidence. It's a sign that understanding the past is still one of the most powerful ways to protect the future, and that protection begins with awareness. If you want to continue reflecting on how economic, political, and human decisions shape the world we live in, subscribe to the channel now. Like this video so that more people can access this discussion, and leave a comment, sharing your doubts, reflections, or personal experiences, anonymously if you prefer. This space exists for thinking together, with respect, depth, and humanity. Because understanding history doesn't change the past, but it can change everything that comes after.